Today, I'm super excited because I am joined with a friend of mine who I've met through this work, who's actually based in New Jersey. So, Brittany, would you like to do a quick intro of who you are and why you're here today? And then we'll get into the conversation.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Brittany Gajewski. I was newly transitioned into my role of Dean of Students at Livingston High School in Livingston, New Jersey. Before that, I was teaching AP and intro level to psychology for the last 9 years. And I've been working very closely with Megan over the last couple months through our equity I'll say our equity initiatives at Livingston Public Schools and at Livingston High School. And I've gotten to know her even more through the CARES training program, which is one of the best professional development programs I've ever experienced, truthfully. So
Oh,
happy to be here.
wonderful. Thank you so much, Brittany. So, today we're talking about ageism, which is discrimination, prejudice, or stereotyping based on someone's age or someone's perceived age. And I like to throw in that perceived age because oftentimes, and I think you and I share similar stories where we're much older than we actually look. I feel like my gray hair gives me away a little bit recently, but up until probably the last few years, I was often assumed to be much younger than I was. And I know that you've shared some stories around that as well. And you talked about your transition into the Dean of Students role. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how people's perception of your age has impacted the work you do.
Yeah, sure. So I know that this came up through our CARES training as well. And I think the first time that I started to notice my age impacting I'll say my job world, my education world, was when I started teaching. I'll say that I graduated from my undergraduate program in 2013. And then I decided to go back to school right away because I wasn't really ready to go like right into the workforce. So I went for my master's and had my first teaching position in 2014 as a leave replacement teacher. And at that time, I was only 22 years old. So I think it's also important to keep into perspective that not only was I so young, but I was also teaching high school. And in some of the classes that I teach, I'm also teaching juniors and seniors. So they probably have siblings, cousins, family members, and friends that are close to my age. So I think that's really where I started to notice okay, I have to figure out a way to create firm boundary lines to make students aware that I'm not on their playing field by any means, and also to make sure that I'm gaining respect in the building. So from there, I'd say that it's become easier as I've gotten older. I haven't had as many staff members come up to me in the hallway asking for hall passes or things like that, but that definitely happened in the beginning of my career. And when I started teaching AP and intro level psychology, that was predominantly seniors. So I would say that most of my teaching experience is with 16, 17, and 18-year olds, which again are at the higher end of our spectrum of what we're talking about. Um, so I really tried very carefully as I navigated my conversations with students and also as I navigated conversations with staff members in the building to just present myself as older or as more mature as I could. I'd say that people that know me really well, once they get to know me and once they listen to me, kind of feel like I'm an old soul. So I think once they hear me talk, they start to say, oh, wait a second, maybe she's not as young as she looks. But I think like when you first meet me, you just make this assumption that I'm a lot younger than I am. And I think too, just being not only young, but also female in a world of education, especially in educational leadership that is still predominantly male, I think sometimes works against me. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And when we think about, you shared quite a bit about how students perceived you and how you weren't that much different chronologically in age from your students. I think about the other end of the spectrum with the administration, as you were referring to towards the end of that, where I went into administration fairly young. So I was pretty young as an administrative leader, and I was told that I needed to act older. And it wasn't that I acted young. I mean, similar to you, I'm kind of an old soul. However, I drink Mountain Dew and I often have my hair in a ponytail. And there's just certain things that are equated to being of younger status
Sure.
that I was told early on to do some very tactical things. So, one example is I remember my very first superintendent when I went into district office. I didn't receive it as much when I was at building level admin. So, when I was a principal, I didn't receive as much of the comments.
Mm.
But when I went into district level admin, I remember being told that I should drink my Mountain Dew out of a coffee cup so that it looks like I'm drinking coffee because adults drink coffee, and I was told that I should wear glasses. This was before I actually wore glasses. Now I have to wear them. But when I was younger, I didn't have to wear glasses. And I was told I should wear glasses because it makes you look older. And I was also told to wear my hair in a bun rather than a ponytail because it looks more older and sophisticated. I'm wondering if you've been told anything as blatant as what I was told in administration, or if you've been given any tips from people who have well intentions, but they're actually exhibiting microaggressions.
So the one that comes to mind is actually something that happened this year because again, this is my first year in the role of dean of students, and it is my first administrative job ever. So when I had first started, fortunately, just for some background context, I would say that I'm fortunate to be serving in an administration of a school building that I've been in for the last 7 years. So I know the players, I know the game. It's a little bit different than just like starting somewhere completely brand new. But when I had first started in the position, one of the main office administrative assistants said that she wanted to speak with me. And she just pulled me aside and kind of said, I just want you to know, like, now that you are, part of the office staff, you have to recognize, like, how to speak with adults. And I was kind of like, well, what do you mean by that? Like, I was just kind of confused by the statement. And she kind of went on to say that, I'm so used to teaching students who are kids, and that the way that I converse and communicate with students is probably different than I communicate with the adults in the building. And now that I'm working in an office setting and an administrative level, I have to be mindful that most of the people that I'm coming into contact with are adults, and that I have to communicate with them differently. And I have to tell you, it really like stuck with me, and is still lingering with me because, quite frankly, I think that this woman is one of the most unprofessional women in this building. So it's hard for me to take that advice, knowing that there have been times where she has made very inappropriate comments towards me and other staff members out of frustration without apology. And yet she's trying to tell me how to behave in this new role, in this new setting. But I am someone, I'll share this with you too, Megan, and I think that this has come up in our conversations prior as well. I am somebody that definitely perceives hierarchy. So I thought that it was really important that you mentioned in the beginning this idea of like perceived or actual ageism, because I have always been taught that whoever's older than me, whoever's above me, knows more, and that I have to respect them at all costs, and that I can never question them. And I think that's one of the reasons why I struggle when it comes to advocating for myself, because in those instances, I don't feel like I have a ground to stand on, because I perceive that these individuals are, whether it's older than me, more experienced than me, have been here longer, whatever it might be. And it's definitely hindered my ability to communicate my needs with them.
Right. And it's interesting because, that's something that society has taught you, right? And I'm sure your family embedded some of that in as well. My family growing up, I had one grandmother who really thought that children should be seen and not heard. It was very embedded in the culture.
Sure.
And it's not that I necessarily believe that to be true, right? I've taught my son to speak up for himself, to ask questions, but my first thoughts are still very much rooted in how I was raised,
Sure.
right? And I'm wondering if you believe that to be true, that people should automatically have a certain level of respect if they're older or more experienced, or is it that those are your first thoughts because that's what you were taught at such an early age that it's hard to transition?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of both because I'm even reflecting on when I started college in my undergrad. I played college volleyball, so I reported to school earlier than the average freshman. And it took me a solid month to be able to break in with the team. And I had such a
Mhm.
difficult time talking with the upperclassmen and just trying to make connections. And I really saw that as, again, a perceived hierarchy. And I think a lot of it comes from a position of respect. Like these are people that I've always been told and coached to respect and to idolize and to never question. And I think that's really where this lingers into my professional life, where I really do struggle to, again, advocate or maybe have the difficult conversation, or maybe say things that might make other people feel uncomfortable because I don't want to hurt their feelings. And I'm doing it out of a sign of respect based on what I've been taught.
Right. So I want to transition for a minute because you're in education. I was in education for a long time. And I think ageism also plays a big role in how our staff members interact with our students. Where I always felt in the teaching world that my students taught me just as much as I taught them. And there are quite a few teachers who don't necessarily believe in that same philosophy. And I'm wondering if you have any ideas or stories of how that's played out for you, either personally or what you've witnessed around ageism in the classroom.
I watched the show Adolescence on Netflix, and it just kind of got me thinking about the students that I come into contact with and the parents and the families that I come into contact with on a regular basis. And I don't know if I necessarily feel like this is because I've transitioned into administration, but I feel like over the last couple of years, the I'll say gap between the students that I'm working with and me has become larger. And I think in the beginning of my career, I used my youth as a way to connect with kids, right? I always kind of called myself like the big sister because I'm not maternal, right? But I wanted to make sure that I still had like an authoritative role. So that's kind of how I would describe it. And I just feel like over time, the gap is just getting wider and wider, which I know is pretty typical. Um, but I really feel like now the current generation that we're serving in high school is like two generations removed from the generation that I consider myself a part of. So in essence, like there is that much of a disconnect between, their world and mine. And I think the best example I can give is just the world of technology and social media. For perspective, I mean, I had a cell phone in eighth grade. That was when I got my first cell phone. It was a flip phone. It didn't have the ability to go on the internet, right? And I didn't make a Facebook account until I was a junior in high school. In full transparency, I'm not a believer in social media just in my personal life to begin with. So I have very limited social media presence, mainly because I'm afraid of it. And also, I
Yeah.
don't consider myself terribly tech savvy. But I do think that that's like the biggest disconnect that I have right now is that kids are talking about all of these different applications and these platforms that, quite frankly, I'm not anywhere familiar with.
Right.
That, and I would say also like the slang. My students always kept me up to date with the slang that they use in their world, in their generation. And I think the reason that I brought up adolescence as well, as a show like on Netflix that's kind of portraying some of the challenges that we're seeing when working with teenagers is that like I didn't necessarily know that there was a language around using emojis. Like I use emojis for very much like the reason that they're intended for, like if
Mhm.
I want to express love, I send a heart, you know what I mean? Like if I am laughing hysterically, I'm sending the like crying emoji of them laughing hysterically. Like it's very literal interpretation.
Right.
But then when I watched that series, I realized that there's a lot of other background context behind it that I'm not aware of. And if I was like investigating like a student conflict or a bullying incident, like I wouldn't have necessarily known that until watching that show. So I think that
Yeah.
is like a part of the disconnect too.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you were talking about technology, and I mean, I had a beeper. I didn't even have a phone, right? I think
Or
a couple years, maybe more than a couple years older than you, right? So I had a beeper, and I remember we had the dial-up ringtone for internet.
Yep.
We didn't even have internet at our house until like I went off to college, and we had a computer that we could use, but when you were online, you couldn't get phone calls.
Right.
Like there were just so many things, like all of those things you think back and you're like, how did we survive back in the day,
So
right?
true. Yep.
And how we acted like we weren't busy is we put the phone up on the thing and just took it off the ringer, like
Right.
there were just so many things. But I have a conversation with my son. I have quite a few conversations with my son about the level of respect in the classroom. And we actually had a conversation with some of the students at his school for our podcast a couple months ago.
Oh,
And
wow.
it was around how teachers respect the students and don't respect the students. And some of the comments that we heard were, well, I'm the teacher, you're the student. You need to learn from me. Or, well, I know better. I've been around longer than you've been alive, right? Or I've been teaching longer than you've been alive. Or so many comments like that that really
Sure.
infer that our children don't know any better. But when you bring up the conversation around emojis and the language, like our children, just like we had our own language,
Right.
our children have their own language, and they are smarter than us in some areas,
Mhm.
and we are smarter than them in some areas. And I think
Right.
it's so important for educators and parents to acknowledge that our youth can teach us something,
Yeah.
and our elder generations can teach us something. I
Right.
mean, we've got both ends of the spectrum, where I think in US society, we have almost cast aside our older generations. And in
Yeah.
other cultures, they very much honor and cherish the older generations a little bit more than the US.
Sure.
Um, do you have any thoughts on the older generation piece of, how so many cultures actually bring their parents back in to live with them when they get to be a certain age? And here in the US, it's they go to nursing homes or
Right.
retirement facilities. Do you have any thoughts around that maybe?
Well, before we get to there, I just wanted to kind of bring up something that you had kind of triggered in my memory as you were speaking about students and respect. And
Yeah.
I think, as I'm kind of reflecting on my own experience, despite the fact that I recognize that I have this perceived hierarchy, right? And that I feel like I have to respect all of those who I consider above me, I never once expected students to have that respect of me. So, like,
Interesting.
even though I was technically the authority figure in the classroom, right? Or even now my role as dean of students, I know that I'm an authority figure in the building. I don't I don't demand that respect. I expect that respect is given by the relationships that we build together. And I used to start off my school years by saying to my seniors, I'm going to treat you like the young adults that I believe that you are until you give me a reason otherwise. Because they were going off to college, they were going off to pursue careers. Like, quite frankly, this was their last like sense of school as they know
Right.
it. So I just think, just in terms of what you were sharing with me about the younger generation and the respect that is or isn't given towards them, it's just interesting to me that I have this, again, like reaction towards the other adults in my life. But when it comes to kids, I can be much more patient and a lot more, I hesitate to use the word tolerant, but I tend to be a lot more receptive to when it comes to how they speak to me. And I try not to take it super personally because I know at the end of the day, they're kids and they're learning.
Yeah. I love that. Love that.
But to your point about the older generation, so I would say that my parents are boomers. They're kind of like older parents than I think most people that are my age, and that was always the case. But my mom was an educator for 37 years, and she always had great relationships with her students, which were some of the most challenging students in the building. She also predominantly taught seniors in high school, ironically enough. So apple doesn't fall too far from the tree, I guess. But and a lot of what she had shared with me in terms of her words of wisdom of working with students of that age is to make sure that you're treating them with respect and that they would give respect back. And The other thing that she would also say, and I recognize that this is probably in poor form, but she really felt like that if a senior was a jerk in their senior year, they were going to be a jerk for the rest of their lives. And there wasn't much we could do about that because like their personality formation has already been developed. So, I only kind of came into contact with like a handful of students I would put in that category. I think that there's a lot of growth that happens during high school, specifically from junior to senior year. And I think she was the one that really helped me see that they could teach us as much as we could teach them. And she kind of lived her life in the classroom that way too. So I felt like I had really good role models from that perspective from the older generations.
Love that. Love that. I want to talk about one more topic before we wrap up for the day, and it's around the idea of multi generational workforces. So, whether it's in a school system or anywhere else, I'm sure you have lots of different generations that work together. And you talked about one interaction you had with a colleague, you talked about your mother. I'm curious, do you see any differences in how people interact with one another based on their age or their generation?
Yeah, I definitely do. I think part of it, I mean, the one idea that I could speak to just at the top of my head in this moment is, you tend to flock to people that are similar to you, right? So
Mhm.
we had junior prom on Friday night, and it was a huge success, no issues, knock on wood, everything went really smoothly. But what I noticed when it came to the staff was that the staff interacted with their people, right? So, and
Mhm.
and part of it was like, yeah, you had your teachers and your administrators kind of separate, right? But you also had like, your math department that were all hanging out because they're used to spending time together. And then I started to notice that even within the staff, you started to kind of break off based off of age. Like by the end of the night,
Interesting.
I spent most of the time talking to staff members that were kind of in my age bracket rather than maybe some of the administrators or staff members that are older than me. So I feel like it's a comfort thing too. Like you just are
Mhm.
drawn to the people that are like you. And a lot of it really is based on, I'm sure, the conversations that you have. And, you know, I do think that that's kind of like the natural portion of what you're describing. But I definitely think that it's important to make sure that you're mixing it up with people of all different backgrounds within any type of industry. I'll tell you, and I'll say this, very candidly, that when it comes to advice, like if I need a coworker or a colleague to give me some, kind of real life advice, whether it's personal or professional, I always go to the women in my life that I call my school moms. And I'm actually in the office of one of them right now who's probably not listening to me. But at the same time, I know that she knows that she's very important to me and she's someone that I respect very much and somebody that, has supported me in this new endeavor and prior to that. So when it comes to like the serious questions, I always go to them. And when it comes to like kind of the silly or more nonsense type of things that I deal with on a daily basis, I feel more comfortable going to people that are kind of aligned with my own age. So I pick and choose, how I communicate and who I communicate with depending on the circumstances. And I think that there's a lot of people that do that too, or should
Absolutely.
do that maybe.
Yeah. Do you have any advice for people as they're thinking about working with people from different age ranges or maybe teachers working with their students? How can age play a part and how can we make sure it doesn't play a negative part in how we communicate with people?
So I think one thing that comes to mind is just making sure that, and again, this kind of goes against what my upbringing has taught me, but you're respecting everyone regardless of how old they are, how young they are, how, experienced they are, what their title is, what their status is, right? And, just to your point from before, we can really learn so much from every different generation and to not necessarily think that you know everything because you're in this role or you have this title or you're this age. I think that becomes very limiting because it kind of closes you off to learning any new information. Um, which I think is one of the benefits in working in a multi-generational industry, right? Is the ability to talk with people from all different backgrounds and all different age ranges that can really share all of their different unique experiences with you. My building principal, for one, has really a very interesting background because he didn't start in education. He actually started in the Marines and he kind of worked his way into this. So his background is entirely different from mine, being super
Right.
traditional. And, you know, if I didn't make those connections, if I didn't have those kind of conversations with him, I wouldn't have necessarily known that, nor would I necessarily recognize that there's a lot of people in education that don't have like the cookie cutter format the way that I've had. So I
Right.
think that that's broadening my horizons too, recognizing how everybody kind of got here. And I think it kind of brings everybody together in a nice way too, to be able to share and swap their stories.
Absolutely. Well, Brittany, thank you so much for sharing your perspectives. It has been a pleasure speaking to you today, as it always is a pleasure speaking to you. And I just want to thank you again for all the work you do for your students and for everyone who gets to work with you on a regular basis. And I look forward to the next conversation, my friend. For everyone else, make sure that you tune in. We have a different interview every month where we talk about the issue of the month and what we're discussing and how we can move forward. I invite you to follow us on social media if you're not already doing so. And again, remember that it is up to each and every one of us to be the change that we need to see in the world. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.